Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Suzanne Kanawi, Marketing Manager at AUC Press. Our book discussion today should last about an hour, and it's recorded and will be uploaded later to our AUC Press Facebook page and YouTube channel afterwards. We will have room for Q&A at the end, so if you have questions, please make sure that you type them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And if you're joining us on Facebook Live, please type your questions in the comment section and we'll make sure to ask them on your behalf. Today, the 29th of November, marks the International Day of Solidarity with Palestinian People. And on that occasion, we'll be discussing the newly published Palestinian Music in Exile, Voices of Resistance by Louise Brehony. This book is a historical contemporary study of Palestinian musicianship in exile in the Middle East, spanning half a century in disparate and undocumented locations. The stories taking center stage show creatively divergent and revolutionary performance, springing from conditions of colonialism, repression, and underdevelopment. Palestinian Music in Exile is the first oral history of contemporary Palestinian musicianship to appear in a book form published by AUC Press and was released worldwide last week. You can order your copy from major bookstores and online booksellers and retailers worldwide, and in Egypt you can find it easily in AUC bookstores or Diwan bookstores. We are delighted to have with us today our author, Louise Brehony, an activist, musician, researcher and educator, and a scholar of Palestinian music. He is the director of the award-winning documentary film Kufaya, A Revolution Through Music, which was produced in 2021. And he has published widely on Palestine and political culture in the Palestine Chronicle, Middle East Monitor, Arab Media and Society, and a range of other journals. Louise received his PhD from King's College London and a master's in composition from the University of Salford, UK, and he performs internationally as a multi-instrumentalist. We're also very privileged today to have with us Dr. Tahrir Hamdi as a discussant and moderator. Dr. Hamdi is a professor of Decolonial Studies and director of Arab Open University in Jordan. She's on the editorial board of several prestigious journals and has published widely on resistance literature. She won the prestigious Abdelhamid Shuman Foundation Prize for the best researcher in the humanities in the Arab world in 2020. And her book, Imagining Palestine, Cultures of Exile and National Identity, was shortlisted for the 2022 Palestine Book Awards. Thank you, Louise and Dr. Tahrir, for joining us today. And without further ado, I'm gonna leave the floor now to Dr. Tahrir. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susan. And you can call me Tahrir without the doctor. Okay. Actually, my book, Imagining Palestine, is shortlisted for the 2023 Palestine Book Awards. It was my mistake writing 2022. But anyway, let me begin this book talk. We have a great book to talk about, and there's a lot to talk about here. I have this copy, but I'm going to get my hardcover soon, I hope. What I really like, Louis, about this book, Palestinian Music in Exile, Voices of Resistance, is that it combines the historical, theoretical, political with the artistic. So we are given context. And I think that nowadays, context is what we're missing, especially when we try to understand what's happening today in Gaza. For example, Palestinian resistance is called terrorism. Slogans like "from the river to the sea" are labeled anti-Semitic, etc. So context, I think, is very important here, and your book provides us with context. But I'd like to begin with the concept of sumud itself, okay? Which is something that we are now witnessing in Gaza. What are we witnessing? The remarkable sumud of our people in Gaza, their fortitude, their bravery, their perseverance. their endurance, their patience, their faith in the face of the Israeli killing machine, if I may term it as such, and I think that would be proper. On Sumud, Lina Miari, for example, in your book, you say, Louis, that she describes Sumud as a revolutionary becoming and a Palestinian anti-colonial mode of being. So is there anything, do you think, that is added to such definitions of Sumud through the study of music in your book and the experiences of Palestinian exile musicians? Also, I'd like to ask you, would you say that your book theorizes Sumud through music? And the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tahrir, and thank you to Susan for that great introduction also. Before I answer your question, Tahrir, I just want to give a brief dedication to three very special young people, Ulfat, Mahir, and Zain. They're aged between 4 and 12 years old, and they're currently homeless in Gaza after the total destruction of their home by Zionist tanks, but whose bravery in the face of a genocidal war on children, I think, can only inspire admiration. In one of a very limited number of messages I received from Abu Mahir, their father, over the last month due to the massive internet blackout, the children smiled while singing in the dark alongside their father, Sofa nabqa huna, we will remain here. This is the same song to poetry by Adel al-Mashiti, which was sung by doctors. People may have seen, there's coverage of it online, outside Al-Auda Hospital on the 26th of October. The lyrics run something like, here we shall stay until the pain goes away. Here we will live, and the melody will be sweet. My proud homeland, my proud homeland. And there are similarities here, of course, to other similar poems in the history of Palestinian revolutionary poetry and song, I would say. So Tawfiq Zayyad, he wrote a poem in, I think, the late 70s or early 80s, or at least in the wake of Land Day in 1976. Hina Baqoon, here we shall stay. This was actually set to music before the 1987 Intifada by various musicians, actually, Firqat Joqa Yuad, women's choir in Galilee, and in English by Zainab Shaath, who ended up in the United States. In another Tawfiq Zayyad poem, which is actually quoted near the start of the book, this time set to music by Jerusalemite resistance singer George Kirmes, he wrote, patience, their fangs will not triumph over my child's smile. And I think that the idea of children and childhood in the Palestinian narrative is exceptionally important. So returning to what you said at the beginning, Tahrir, is Sumud a way of understanding music, or is music in Palestine a way of understanding Sumud? I think the two are intimately connected in many different ways. One thing that I talk about in the book is the idea of a kind of a grassroots Sumud, which embodies an element of critique, which I think is really important to focus on. So, for example, in the 1970s, Rosemary Sayegh, when she did her classic ethnographies in Lebanon, in the camps, she spoke and quoted refugee women who would say that any Arab leader that wants to be a mukhtar or a leader will mention the Palestinian people in their speech. You know, so there is this, on this grassroots level, there is this dismissal, there's this biting critique, which I think we don't see often in the mainstream. And I think part of the narrative of Sumud, this culture, this tradition of, I would say, politicized critique runs through it. So listening to musicians from Gaza, for example, if you read the chapter, there are 2 chapters in the book about Gaza, but the second one about a younger generation of musicians, including Reem Ambar, the oud player, when she speaks about the conservatoire system of the Edward Said School, for example, that was essentially grafted into the Palestinian context based on a European model. she speaks, and not only Reem, other musicians speak, Ahmed al-Khatib, and people like Khalid Gibran of a previous generation, the generation linked to the famous Sabreen band from Jerusalem. They have this real biting critique of European modes of musical instruction that are grafted onto the Palestinian context, or translated onto the Palestinian context, in the words of Gibran. So I think this idea of critique really speaks back to this. And running through the music also, we see a critique of all manner of different phenomena that have risen in the Palestinian context. So in the context of the Oslo peace deal from 1993 and the aftermath of that, musicians and artists of varying Palestinian communities, both in Palestine and outside of Palestine, were really at the forefront of critiquing that. So in the final chapter, I talk about Basil Zayed, who wrote a satirical anthem, Dola, about the Palestinian Authority and its quest for statehood recognition. And the whole song is really mocking this idea that that statehood, or the PA version of statehood, is really a solution to the problem. And I think this culture is really part and parcel of Sumud. You know, it is a form of resistance, and it's a form of speaking back to the dominant narrative.
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Louis. A little bit more on Sumud. In your book, you say that Raja Shehadeh identifies Sumud as alternative resistance. And then you say a little bit later on, okay, and I'm reading from your book, page 12, the introduction. You say, like Kanafani's prose, the poetic material and storytelling on which much of Palestinian music is built defies the separation of armed struggle and basic survival, often indexing further struggles in Arab lands. So my question is, Louis, what do you think Raja Shehadeh means by Sumud being alternative resistance? What is he opposing Sumud to here? Why is it alternative? And does it contradict your understanding of Sumud as I just read to you on page 12, when you say that it defies the separation of armed struggle and basic survival? So what is Sumud then, in its comprehensive meaning?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Again, you referred to Lina Ma'ari in your introduction at the beginning of this talk. I think her definition of Sumud really springs from the context of, well, if people have not read her work, then they should. She interviewed many Palestinian political prisoners and saw Sumud as a form of defiance on the inside of the Zionist colonial jail. And I think the way she words it as a revolutionary becoming, or as Palestinians embodied in a ongoing and continual fight, I think is really important. The fight cannot be separated from the Sumud. Now, the question of an alternative resistance, I think it depends how you phrase it and who's doing the phrasing, to be honest. I mean, there is a campaign or an organization, if you want to call it that, in the Palestinian Ghorba, in the exile in Europe and the United States, called Masar Badil. Masar Badil means alternative path. Yeah. So there is a real, and you know, I would see this organization as among the leftist and most principled adherents of the resistance struggle in all of its forms. So there is a recognition, I think, at the mass level, particularly among the refugees, of the need for an alternative. Now, I think Raja Shehadeh poses the question slightly differently. And just for context, so he posed this question, I think, before the first Intifada, in the kind of, let's say, in the context where Sabra and Shatila came about, and there were certain questions over the armed resistance movement, and there was certainly an impasse, if not a deeper crisis of the movement that was still to be resolved at that time. I think, however, there is there is a danger of separating the sumud that Lina Ma'ari describes and that we've discussed, and that Tahrir, you describe so eloquently in your own work. There's a danger of separating that from the physical armed resistance movement. And I think somebody like Ghassan Kanafani was probably the archetypal figure of where this separation of is impossible. You know, it's part and parcel of the same thing. Just to go back to the kind of musical aspects of this. So these threads of steadfastness are, I would say, continual in Palestinian history, and music helps to illustrate this point. I'll play a short musical clip in a moment if I can. But to summarize, born from imperialist conquest rivalry, Zionism destroys, displaces, colonizes, burns, massacres. But at the same time, we see this huge oppression in the past month. You know, many people have described it as unprecedented in the scale of it. But at the same time, Zionism as a colonial project only fuels the political culture of opposition in the hearts and minds of the masses. And this, of course, is part and parcel of the idea of steadfastness. And Palestine lives, despite everything, to sing and perform to the world. I would say it's actually to the credit of the contributors to this book, and not particularly to my own ingenuity in any sense, that this text that we're discussing today contains hundreds of stories, subplots, and possible focuses. Given the centrality of children to the suffering and the hopes in the context of Gaza, I think it is right at the current time, in the context of discussion, to talk a little bit more about childhood. Before I do that, I just want to play a short musical clip, and then I'll just tell you a little bit about why I've played this clip, if that's okay. Tahrir, maybe if you can just give me a thumbs up that you can hear this. I think I can share my audio.
Okay.
I hope people, if you don't speak Arabic, I hope at least you spotted the kind of call and response between the male and female voices in that version of the song, which I think is quite important. So the song is called Hizz al-Rimh, which roughly means shake the spear. Now, interesting, we can go into a discussion of what the spear is. Is it a physical spear in terms of a weapon? Is it a spear of wheat growing on the land of Palestine? Is it even the groom in a Palestinian wedding? And now I came across this song from the singing of a Palestinian vocalist in Gaza, Rowan Al-Kasha. We should note she remains in Gaza, and she's been there throughout this crisis with her young children. She is featured in the same chapter in the book as Saeed Surur and Reem Ambar, both Ghazawi musicians from the same generation. Rowan Al-Kasha comes from a very large and well-known family of musicians. Her brother Muhammad, in fact, is the oud player on the front of the book, performing in the rubble of the bombed Saeed al-Mashal Theatre in 2018. Now, describing her childhood involvement in music, Rowan said, "I was surrounded by music as a child, as though our house was a place of music and artistic training. The first sound I remember hearing came from my father's oud, beginning my love for music. Later, as I got a little bigger, teachers noticed that I had a talent and put me at the center of school radio broadcasts, national celebrations at school events. And of course, singing at family events helped to build my talents at the same time." Now, this song, Hizz al-Rimh, the version that I played was recorded by a well-known Palestinian song and dance troupe, Firqat al-Funun, who are based in Al Bira near Ramallah. And this was one of a number of resistance songs that was sung by Roano Kasha and her band, Firqat Dawaween, during a concert at the Said al-Masha Theatre on 10th of March 2016. The lyrics to the song reference Jenin, Nablus, Beit Imreen, and many sites of historic struggle. In fact, the song, if you read Ghassan Kanafani's classic analysis of the 1936 to 1939 revolution, published in 1972, the lyrics to this same song, recorded over almost a century later, appear in Ghassan Kanafani's text about the 1930s and the struggle against the British. And this really shows its continuity with a generation that grew up during the Al-Aqsa Intifada, as Rowan did. In their version of this song, sadly, I could only find a short clip of the concert. If anybody wants to see it, please send me a message and I'll send you the clip. With their version, this call and response between Rowan and another vocalist, Raouf Bilbaisi, the male vocalist with the Dawaween band, they trade lyrics in the chorus to the song. And I argue in the book that Rowan takes on the role of Mother Palestine. So the chorus to this song is quite emblematic of this this idea of a kind of a female protector of the land, which I think is quite interesting. And remaining on the subject of childhood, Rowan, when she sang this on the stage, she was also pregnant at the time. So there are all kinds of meanings. Now, themes of childhood and childbirth appear in the narratives of other musicians appearing in the text, describing her own upbringing around her Aghani Mama, her mother's songs in the home in Kuwait, as like Zatru Zait, so like dried thyme and olive oil, so this natural existence of music. Vocalist and broadcaster Reem Kalani was exposed to all kinds of worldly musical influences which shaped her career, but Palestine remained central. She describes, for example, visiting her childhood or her familial homeland village of Nin, near Jenin, in the 1970s, and witnessing a wedding vocalist who welcomed the family, and she describes him as the umbilical cord. So there are all of these kind of connections that I think really link the ideas of childhood and the transmission of these narratives of Sumud and belonging to Palestine that I think are really central to many of these musical stories.
Okay, very interesting. Thank you very much, Louis. Louis, the reason I mentioned, previously Raja Shahadi's alternative resistance, we have to maybe look into it a little bit more closely because, I wanted to emphasize the fact that you cannot separate the culture of resistance from the revolutionary, let's say, armed struggle. The two are not separate entities. In order for a liberation movement to be successful, you need a strong culture of resistance. And almost all revolutionary theorists have theorized that. People like Ghassan Kanafani, you mentioned Ghassan. And by the way, we're working on a book on Ghassan Kanafani's political thought. So that should be coming out soon, maybe, in 2024. But I do want to, emphasize the connection, the link. It's like a lifeline. I mean, there can be no successful armed struggle without a very strong, culture of resistance. But I want to go back to Ghassan Kanafani. Ghassan wrote a very important, of course, in addition to his novellas and his literary work, he wrote some theoretical work as well, some theoretical pieces, I think, called Resistance Literature in Occupied Palestine, 1968, 60, something like this. I forgot the exact date. In it, he theorizes resistance literature. In fact, he was the first really to use the term resistance literature, adab al-muqawamah. And he differentiated resistance literature under occupation from that in exile. However, your book basically emphasizes Palestinian music in exile. But what he said about resistance literature written under occupation, he said this kind of literature is characterized by having an admirable hope and a constant revolutionary fervor, in opposition to the kind of poetry that was being written in exile at that time. But in your book, I feel that this Palestinian music in exile is very much hopeful. It's not simply music of lamentation and sorrow and, you know, or in by any means defeat. It is very much a hopeful music. It is very much a revolutionary music. Would you say this is true, Louis, of this book and Palestinian music in exile? How would you characterize it?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, firstly, I think it's important to just to clarify or to define the point of exile. I mean, Edward Said said Palestine is exile, Palestine itself.
Absolutely.
And I would not want, looking at the cover, people might read the title of the book and think, well, this is not about Palestine itself. This is about Palestinians outside. But actually, we define in the text that Gaza, for example, you know, more than half or way more than half of the population of Gaza are refugees from elsewhere in Palestine. Well, that's also true. You know, there are big refugee camps, and they're at the center of the confrontations right now in the occupied West Bank, places like Jenin, but also historic Palestine. So there is a chapter in the book about 48 Palestinians and the oud player Said Silbat, who comes from a family which was internally displaced in 1948 and ended up in the city of Shefa Amr, even though they did not have maternal or paternal roots in there. So exile does not just mean Palestinians who end up in the US or in camps in Lebanon or Jordan or Syria. It has a much broader and sometimes a much closer context, I would say. In terms of the idea of optimism, I think this is something that runs through the book in different ways. Now, of course, we could look at what is happening in Gaza right now and emphasize, as many people do, the inherently tragic nature of what is happening. You know, the numbers and the actual physical destruction and the human destruction of Gaza, just it defies belief. You know, it's just horrific, of course. Now, the intensification of that occupation of Gaza speaks actually to an earlier time. Now, Gaza has always been the center of repression and resistance. At the time that Ghassan Kanafani was writing, he spoke about the need for a popular war of liberation and said that Gaza at that point in the early 70s was the only place that was proving capable of actually building that necessary armed movement. Now, in the book, so we're talking about a time, certainly for the second generation of musicians in Gaza that I talk about, we're talking about a time from the early 2000s of the Ariel Sharon government and the massacres that took place in Gaza and the blockade and the occupation, which, you know, was really horrific. And of course, today we might see the outgrowth of that kind of genocidal system of practice. But the chapter itself is entitled Ahla Ayyam, the most beautiful days. Now, one might think, for a Palestinian growing up in Gaza during that context, you know, wasn't there just death and destruction everywhere? Well, of course there was, you know, there was death and destruction everywhere, and every family knew or were related to martyrs or had people that were thrown into the occupation jails at the same time. But one of the musicians described that nevertheless as Ahla Ayyam. Why? Lish, limada? Well, precisely because I would say of their involvement in a movement of resistance which embodied all of the different aspects of Palestinian culture. So the musicians featured in that second chapter about Gaza, Rowan Okasha, Reem Ambar, Said Surur, I think their narrative defies a categorization in terms of a tragic narrative and a hopeless narrative. Their music, if you listen to Soul Band, for example, which is a group of young musicians, of which Saeed Surur is a member, and Faris Ambar is also featured in another chapter in a book. He's the percussionist with Soul Band. Their music is really uplifting, and the way that they describe that music has an uplifting sense as well. So the songs that are described in that chapter, there's a traditional song, Al Rosanna, which many people will know. Al Rosanna, Al Rosanna. I'm not going to sing it. It's known widely to the region now. It is said that this song has roots in the Ottoman period, and that the Al Rosanna was a ship which arrived during a great famine to Lebanon or Palestine, depending on whose story you listen to. This ship arrived to a hungry people and turned out to be empty. And the lyrics to the Al Rosanna are about how Al Rosanna, the ship, has betrayed the people. So it's this real song of sadness and betrayal. Now, in the soul band arrangement of this song, which I discuss in that particular chapter, firstly, they changed the maqam, the scale with which the song is sung and played. And they create a kind of a tempo, and it was to do with visual as well. They created a video to go with the song, of the band smiling, of the band singing in a particular way. So even though the context and the history and the content of this song, this traditional song, had this element of sadness and tragedy, Said used the word flip. So they would flip it, they would invert it. You could think of it like a maqluba, turning something on its head. Yeah, so turning around this idea of sadness and presenting an optimistic, joyful. The word farah, joy, is used constantly in interviews with these musicians, presenting this frame of singing and being. And Reem Ambar, featured in the same chapter, we spoke about this recently. She was interviewed by an academic in Europe, and this academic, quite surprisingly, since this person is so well versed in Arab culture, was surprised to hear that Palestinian music is not all about sadness and tragedy. And the Reem explained, well, no, we sing about the olive harvest, we sing about weddings. For every social occasion, we have a form of song and a form of sung poetry.
About
so
life.
There is this optimistic tradition that is attached to it, I would say.
Even this kind of, singing about olive trees and happiness and weddings, it's a living in sumud. It's a kind of defiance, as we see our people in Gaza doing nowadays. I was just thinking even about repurposing of songs, traditional songs, from our Palestinian heritage. Now you see it when they're played, even at Palestinian weddings, they become songs of resistance. You discuss this as well. Do you want to comment on that, Louis?
Yeah, I think this is really interesting because even the song that I mentioned, His Rimh, that Shake the Spear, has this connection with weddings. And so many songs that have become resistance songs do have this historic connection. In fact, many of the songs sung by musicians, including Reem Ambar or Reem Talhami and the late Reem Banna. There are so many talented Palestinian Reems, by the way. So many of them date.
I was going to say that they're all named Reem, by the way.
Well, I'm sure there's a few Tahrirs as well. But many of these songs date to way before the Nakba and even way before the British occupation, some of them.
Absolutely.
And were part of this rural wedding tradition, or the tradition of the Zajjalin. So if people don't know what the Zajjalin, it's almost like a poet singer or a bard that would come to a wedding, and there's a real tradition of having two of them, where they would have this kind of debate between them. And there's some ethnomusicological research about that you can read also. So this kind of debate. Now, with the revolution of the 1930s, with the Nakba, with the Naksa, with the rebirth of the Palestinian Revolution, with the Intifadat, with all of these historic events came new lyrics or new reframings of these traditional wedding songs or rurally referential songs. So bands like Al-Ashiqeen, which were one of the most famous Palestinian bands in the 70s and 80s, and are still listened to by many today, many of their songs were based on melodies, at least, that were existent in the Palestinian folk tradition. So when they sung Sijin Akka, about Akka prison, about the execution of these three heroes by the British, the melody to this piece is actually a folk melody that had arguably nothing to do with the national struggle, but it was kind of nationalized in a sense and brought into the struggle. If I can just play another short musical example, Tahrir, is that okay?
We'd love that.
So I'll play it and then I'll say why I played it. 1 second. Again, thumbs up if you can hear it.
All right.
So we've not got a lot of time, so just play a short clip of that. So this is from a band in Haifa, in occupied Haifa. The band's name is Darbat Shams, which means sunstroke. This song was actually composed as a lullaby by Samer, the leader of the band. Of course, lullabies are also an important genre of Palestinian songs traditionally. The lead singer is Hanan Wakim, and they sing in the lyrics that we just heard, "Fly high, O dove, over Bilad al-Sham," which is Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, Jordan. "Wipe Sykes-Picot off the map before Bisan grows up." Bisan is the niece of the songwriter, so he wrote this melody to this song to her. Talking about wipe Sykes-Picot off the map. So if people don't know, Sykes-Picot was the agreement between the British and the French in the First World War to essentially or literally carve up the Middle East between themselves as their possessions. And of course, the Zionists hate this imagery of wiping things off the map. You know, this is what they always come out and say: you want to wipe Israel off the map, such and such a thing. Well, of course, they're trying to wipe Gaza off the map currently. We should not forget that. But it's quite interesting the way that this song is framed and the way that it is aimed at childhood. Also, it's a lullaby. I write in the section where I mentioned this song in the final passages of the book, where many Palestinian artists and poets had asked questions through their work. Darbat Shams, the band, offered a radical solution, pinpointing the modern tribulations not just of Palestine but of a wider region, suffering the legacy of Sykes-Picot, Balfour, and ongoing imperialism. Just to add to that, I think it would be correct to see optimism in these lyrics and the musical stylings. But beyond this, I would say there is a revolutionary commitment to a new generation. So what is being sung in this lullaby speaks not only to Palestine, but it speaks to Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, arguably in the context of resistance now to Yemen and to other countries. And ultimately, I think this is an international invitation for listeners to join the voices of resistance.
Beautiful. Very nicely said, Louis. I really like that. Your book also presents, it has a very strong theoretical background, theoretical framework. And you talk about, of course, Kanafani's theoretical work, Edward Said, Frantz Fanon, Amilcar Cabral. You bring up many important theorists, and Lukács is one of them as well, and class consciousness. Edward Said took the idea, turned it into the intellectual critical consciousness, or the critical consciousness of the intellectual. In chapter 4, I think you use such ideas when you talk about the music or Palestinian music in Egypt. Very interesting chapter that is. Would you like to comment on it?
Yeah, briefly, because we could be here forever talking about connections between Egypt and Palestine, but I think it's fitting since this is an AUC meeting. I think it's interesting also to look further back than I did in this chapter in terms of the Palestinian-Egyptian musical connection. So, for example, in the 1920s and 30s, some of the most famed Egyptian vocalists and musicians, not just Egyptian, from the wider region, came to Palestine, came to cities like Jaffa and Haifa and Al-Quds. So people like Kulthum, people like Muhammad Abdul Wahab, also from Syria, Muhammad Abdul Karim was a prominent musician who came. So there was this connection in the early days, and one of the things that the Nakba really destroyed was this burgeoning urban musical scene. At the same time, when the confrontation with Zionism and imperialism really began to evolve and take shape and really culminate in the Nakba, many Palestinian musicians that were active and recorded in Palestine during that period went to Egypt and became recording artists there. Mm-hmm. Just to fast forward, so the book chapter that discusses Egypt focuses on Taimour Abu Ghazala. If people don't know his work, they should check him out. He's a really kind of avant-garde and interesting musician, and uses a lot of interesting poetic and musical and aesthetic ideas in his work. Now, I'm sure Taimour will not be offended when I say that the chapter about him is actually about his mentor, about Khalid Gibran, who I've mentioned. Khalid acted as a mentor to Taimour, but also to other musicians, including Naib Barghouthi, including Nizar Rohana and other Palestinian musicians. Now, Khalid Gibran, in the interviews that I did with him, he came across as such an interesting character and such a really kind of critical character. And there are some, by the way, quotes from Khalid that I cannot say here on air, especially before many children's bedtimes, but you can find them in the book. Interesting what he says about French horns. But what he really had put forward in the discussions, Khalid, was about essentially an existential cultural crisis that, witnessed by Egyptians, certainly since the death of people like Kulthum and Abdul Wahab, but further back, arguably, to find roots in the defeat in June 1967, which was the impetus for Kanafani and other people and their kind of theoretical and political writings. Now, Khalid was describing a situation in the early years of the first Intifada. So he led a group of musicians in Cairo in essentially an alternative kind of pedagogical program. So he had left behind what became the Edward Said School of Music in Palestine. It was just called the National Conservatoire at that point. And he turned his back on the conservatoire model. And he attempted to kind of to come up with a new model, which was based on a more of a kind of a worldly open-mindedness to music, and expose these young musicians to training by Iranian musicians, by Indian musicians, Moroccan musicians. Now, he describes hitting a brick wall with some Egyptian musicians. He said that at that point, they were not ready to smash the pyramids. Now, the pyramids in Egyptian music, and he would describe it in this way: Kulthum, Muhammad Abdul Wahab, Muhammad al-Qasabji, Assalamu alaikum. You know, so there is this connection to the history. And now he was describing the process of revolutionizing music. And Khalid is from the generation of Sabrin, this revolutionary Palestinian band from the 1980s. And he was attempting, I think, to instill the same kind of revolutionary aesthetic and open-minded ideas in the music that he and the Sabrin generation had essentially brought about in Al-Quds, and struggled to do that in the Egyptian environment. I won't speak too much about that because I think there is a debate there about the direction of Egyptian culture, particularly after 2011. Actually, he said that after 2011, Egyptians were ready to smash the pyramids in a musical and aesthetic sense. One thing he did say, and I think this was the kind of defining feature of his musical pedagogy, and arguably today, he said that he had one aim: to be musically victorious over Tel Aviv.
Very nice. Very effectively put there. I'm looking at some questions from our audience. Okay, the first one is by Lina Deeb. Yeah, she's one of our students. Good evening, everybody. Thanks, Dr. Lewis Brehony, for giving us the chance to attend this enriching meeting. Okay, let me get to the question. My question to you is the following. She says, I do have faith that Palestine will be free soon, very soon. In the light of this hope, how do you see the future of resistance songs after liberation? And what's the best way, from your point of view, to preserve them from being ignored or lost?
Interesting question. Thank you, Lina. Well, firstly, I mean, I do have some answers do spring to mind for this question, but I think there are limits of to the certain role played by an admittedly Western academic. You know, I would not like to be too prescriptive and tell Palestinians what the correct path is for their liberation or for their culture. However, I think that there are some, and this is discussed in the book, about situations of post-liberation. So I speak about the Cuban composer Leo Brouwer in one of the chapters, and he speaks about colonialism and the relationship between music and colonialism. I think from a slightly different perspective than Palestinians or others who are fighting for their liberation, because the Cuban context is, you know, they've already kicked out the colonialists and the imperialists. So I think looking at those examples, I think is quite important. At the same time, you mentioned preservation. Now, there is this great debate, and even if it is not a spoken debate, it is a debate that is argued through the adoption of different aesthetic and musical forms, I would say, over whether the music should be preserved or whether it should be totally revolutionized. For example, you will read about people in the book whose sole mission is to preserve tradition. Now, their version of preserving tradition may be presented slightly new. So the Shabab in South Lebanon who play the Scottish bagpipes are really convinced that they are furthering and preserving Palestinian culture as it has always been. And there are other musicians from the same group who are against the use of electronic instruments because they want to keep the musical tradition pure, in a sense of, you know, keeping it within that traditional basis. There are other musicians in the book. I mentioned Tamar Abba Ghazala, but there are others. You know, there are guitar players. There are even pianists and musicians or rappers. You know, I didn't write a chapter about rap, but there are rappers mentioned in there, and they've formed part of the research. They are Palestinian musicians, but arguably they do not perform Palestinian music in the sense that it is understood. So there are all of these things going on. I mean, I would not like to be too prescriptive in a stylistic or a genreific, if that's a word, sense of what Palestinian music should be. I think
is Palestinian music just one thing? You were talking about traditional Palestinian music, and I don't know if Lina meant to preserve it in the sense of keeping it pure. Well, isn't Palestinian music a reflection of the historical process? It uses instruments now that would be considered Western instruments rather than Arabic instruments. Rap is part of it. So isn't it still, can't we call it Palestinian music, or does it have to be like heritage music? We have other questions. I don't want to, be asking all my own questions, but just a short answer. Maybe then we'll go on to other questions.
Yeah, listen, I think just to refer to oud players, for example, the oud is a very traditional music, but some may see the music played by an oud player like Simon Shaheen or Ahmed El Khatib as being non-Palestinian because it's a largely, well, Egyptian, Iraqi, Syrian. They take the musics of a wider region and call that their heritage. And of course, Palestine is not in a bubble, separate from that. At the same time, all of these exile experiences, they throw up their own music. So Reem Kalani was exposed to stage music. Ahmed El Khatib was exposed to this incubator of Iraqi oud music. The Shabab in Lebanon were exposed to music performed on different instruments. So I think it really depends on the context also.
Yeah. Because we're running out of time, Louis, I'm gonna read off these questions and let's see if you can if you can answer them all in one. Well, that's your job. The first one, what drew you to Palestinian music and how did you find your way discovering these musicians? And this question, let me just read out the name. It's by Aya Fakhri, maybe. NG Matar says, how did the Palestinian music of resistance evolve over time? More specifically, did major events such as the Intifada and even what's happening today affect the essence of the music? Muhammad Anwar says, how can we support Palestinian musicians? And another one from Muhammad Anwar also, what do you think of new Palestinian rappers on the music scene who are going viral right now? I don't know where you want to start, but the floor is yours.
Well, firstly, I don't have the answer to everything, but I think you will find at least partial explanations and maybe detailed explanations to some of these in the book, if I can direct people in that direction. Just very quickly, what drew me to Palestinian music, I was an anti-war activist and music student in 2003 and was really attracted to both in a sense, and in terms of understanding the world and understanding my place in it, I think. And at the time, I had no idea that I would perform this kind of music. It was literally an appreciation kind of thing and understanding it alongside coming to understand what was going on in Palestine and the Middle East. In terms of the evolution of this music over time, I would say 100% yes, the Intifada and all historic events in Palestine have led to having an influence, but also the displacement, the mass displacement of the Palestinian people. I mean, you may look at the huge array of genres that exist in Palestinian music. I think that is an unintended side effect of the fact that Palestinians have been displaced. And I think it's part of the popular ingenuity of the Palestinian people that so varied means have been used to express the Palestinian narrative in different ways. How can we support Palestinian musicians? I think firstly to amplify their voices, and I think this is linked to your last question, Mohammed. I think that social media platforms are doing their best to keep a lid on any Palestinian content right now, even if it is a popular rapper or a musician. They're really kind of trying to clamp down, and their algorithms are really now set towards repressing and suppressing those voices, whether it's through music, through direct politics or drawing or in other ways. So I think really the battle on our hands, or the battle on the hands of the Palestinian musicians and their supporters, is not just to fight against the tide of these billionaires and zillionaires who own these social media corporations, but I think to find other spaces and to find other platforms. And I think that involves live music, but it also means organizing, organizing political movements, I think, is part and parcel of building an alternative culture and vice versa.
We're almost, our time is almost up. I just have one final question for you. I mean, there's a lot of solidarity around the world, with the Palestinian cause, especially with the genocide that is going on right now in Gaza. And a lot of musical solidarity as well. A very new song out by Loki. I don't know if you've heard it. Palestine Will Never Die. Do you think that this will help the cause to become even more popular? Will it, especially when people with, who are well known, let's say outside the Arab world, start singing about Palestine, playing for Palestine, standing in solidarity with Palestine? What do you think about this kind of solidarity?
Yeah, I think that has to be part of it. And historically, it's always been part of it. There were international musicians that were part and parcel of the South African
Roger
relations,
Waters,
for example.
yeah.
Yeah, people like Roger Waters. Again, there is this process of fighting to be heard, though, at the same time. So as soon as this onslaught broke out, the most recent Zionist wave, Loki, who you mentioned, his song Terrorist, was banned by YouTube and by all of the major social media corporations. So there is this real battle to be heard, I think, which really leads us back to the grassroots and the need to build a movement. But, like I say, I think this is an international phenomenon. It's not going to go away anytime soon. The Palestinian people's voices are not going to be silenced despite everything. And I think, us in the kind of international arena, we have to be part of that in one way or another. Just to add, finally, I do think it's important that Palestinian voices in a musical sense are heard. I'm going to Ireland this weekend as part of I think it's about a month-long event called Artists for Palestine, Irish Artists for Palestine. And there are so many musicians that have signed up and dedicated themselves to the cause, which is incredible. Irish solidarity with Palestine, I think, is really important. At the same time, you do not see many Palestinian names on there. So I think part of what this book seeks to do is to make those names known and to make, people around the world aware of the fact that Palestinian musicians are active in every country and really have something to say and sing and play.
Absolutely. Keep talking about Palestine, keep singing about Palestine. Louis Brehony, thank you so very much. And again, we're going to remind our audience of the title. Okay. Yeah, there you go. Palestinian Music in Exile, Voices of Resistance by Louis Brehony. Get it.
Yes, you can purchase
Yes.
your copy anywhere in major bookstores and online book retailers. It's also available as an ebook if you want to order it, and in Egypt if you want to order it. As I mentioned, you find it in AUC bookstores, and actually we're starting a book fair tomorrow. If you want to get it at a discount, that's your chance. And yeah, I really want to thank you, Luis and Tahrir, for this insightful and interesting conversation and discussion of the book. Too bad we didn't have enough time for all of the questions that we're receiving. So if anyone wants to get an answer, maybe a conversation, just send it to AUC Press. I'll try to find a way to get the answer for you. Luis, I mean, it's a great effort, and that book, when we planned the publishing of it, it wasn't like, the situation was completely different, and I think it came at a very difficult but timely manner, as we would say. So I hope you really read it and support Palestinians everywhere. Solidarity with Palestine. The recording of this talk will be available on our Facebook page and YouTube channel. And Luis, if you want to say anything at the end.
No, just thank you to everybody that's helped to organize this event, and apologies to the people who we did not have time to discuss, but please do get in touch. This is an ongoing conversation, and there are going to be many, many more events. Yes.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everybody, for attending. And a lot of people I see they're thanking Louis and everything. Thanks again, Louis. Thank you, Susan. It was a great talk. I enjoyed it very much.
The same here. Take care, everyone. Peace.
Thank you.